Good afternoon, everyone. It is time to begin environmental matters. It's just after 1:30. I'm joined by Alderman Pfeiffer and Alderman Arnett. I think we'll have a relatively quick agenda today. We have legislation, the 2 leases for the boat shows, and then we have a water treatment plant update and environmental commission update. And that's all we have today. Yep, so that'll be quicker unless they arrive. So once there are any changes to agenda, first look for a motion for the approval of the minutes.
Move approval. Second.
All those in favor? Aye. None opposed? And now we're ready for legislation. 0917 and 01017. If there are no objections, I'll take them together. Anyone interested in speaking to these 2 pieces of legislation, please step up.
Good afternoon. My name is Paul Jacobs. I am with the boat shows. I reside at 3442 Rockaway Avenue in Annapolis.
Welcome, Mr. Jacobs.
Thank you.
And Ashley?
Ashley Leonard, acting city attorney. So I guess these are a little different than the past ones you've looked at. We were going a long-term route with these. Otherwise, most of the material terms are the same. What's going to happen is there will be an initial term of 1 year and 5 one-year renewal terms, guaranteed, provided there's no defaults or force majeure. At the end of 6 years for both of these leases, the boat shows then have the option to extend it for another 4 one-year renewable terms, which would be a total of 10 years. But we wanted to put a break in there in case things change, the boat show decides it can no longer handle, say, the spring show, hopefully not the fall show. But so there's just a little break there to allow for just sort of a reconsideration before we move into an additional 4 years. Otherwise, the rent is pretty much the same. The standard terms are the same. The premises have been tweaked a little bit.
A little bit, not much.
But not much.
Yeah, I think the rent structure, recognizing that over time economic conditions change and there should be some recognition of cost of living increases, that kind of thing. There has been some provision for that moving forward. The same thing with some of the reimbursement of city expenses, city fees, also with a formula developed to handle that. For
the rent piece, it's still either a minimum payment or a percentage of ticket sales. So the economic sort of adjustment is made to the minimum payment, not to the ticket sales, because ticket sales is just ticket sales. And we tend to make, the city at least tends to make more money off of the percentage of the ticket sales, so hopefully that'll continue to be the way it rolls. City fees are also going to be adjusted up. The fall boat show already has a history of city fees for things like police, public works, and fire. The spring show has no history of those, so we're sort of ramping those up gradually to allow for them over the next 10 years. But for the past several years, they have not been paying any city fees for the spring boat show.
Anything else? Anything further, Mr. Jacobs?
I think that those were the main changes. It was a lot of work in establishing language that was acceptable and that on both sides, and it seemed to handle most of the issues that we experienced. Most of the dates we've tried to anticipate over the next 6 years, although those 6 years leading out there, although it's a long way in the future to determine that. The premise was also that there are a lot of things that we as a company would like to be able to do in terms of our infrastructure and working with the city and redeveloping and rebuilding some of the areas that are critical, and that's why the long-term lease idea came into play in the first place. So that's kind of the premise behind it. But I think that in terms of content of the lease, it's been cleaned up, it's been made consistent, and I think that those are the main areas were some things with dates, the rent, and handling cost of living increases.
Any questions, Alderman Pfeiffer? No. Alderman Arnett?
So a couple different kinds of questions. First of all, need to understand a little bit better why we're doing 1 year with 4 automatically renewables rather than a 5-year. Is there a legal reason?
We wanted to be able to pause each year to check for any defaults or force majeure issues. So before, the renewals for all intents and purposes are automatic except if there's a default or force majeure. We didn't want to keep running the years. We sort of wanted to find a compromise between what we do now, which is each year individually, and a long term. And this seems sort of the best sort of compromise, so that each year it would be automatic unless there was a major problem. And then that language would allow us to address that major problem before rolling into the next year. And we're talking like serious defaults or like city dock ends up underwater sort of issues. Otherwise, it'll roll forward like normal, but we just wanted to have a check-in every year to make sure there weren't, since the city hasn't done a lot of long-term leases, that there weren't any problems on a bigger scale.
Well, that gets to my question, which is, so there is no discretion on the city's part other than some default or some other thing to say, no, we want to take this year's lease up.
That's correct.
Totally automatic.
It's automatic unless there's a default or force majeure, because that was sort of the compromise, because in order for them to be able to get financing and do infrastructure and improvements like they want, they need a longer term lease. So the city is essentially saying yes to the 10 years except for if there's a problem.
Okay, and that's, I think, what we intended.
Yeah. So
Right.
I mean, it was sort of, we're walking a fine line because we haven't done too many of these, so this is our first attempt at it. See how it goes?
So the other question is more of a issue about now that the Fawcett's building, for the lack of a better word, I guess the John Bruno building, is not available and it's parking. Has that caused any reconfiguration? I'm trying to get my laptop to give me the
That's probably
attachment showing the
yeah, that's something that I should respond to. At this point in time, we're working with the 110 compromise. We'll call it that building as opposed to a Bruno building. We're working with the 110 compromise people, and they've extended our lease on the parking lot through 2018, and seem to be willing to continue with that going forward. They recognize that the value to anybody like a restaurant, a tenant in there, would be to have the boat shows there.
Okay.
They also recognize that if they take away the parking lot from us, that takes out 133 exhibitors and 2 shows, and would virtually gut the land portion of our show. And they would have to move somewhere else, which would take the business away from there or away from Annapolis. So we've spoken at length about this. They've been very cooperative, at least in saying that they will make sure that all tenants understand that they lose the parking lot for 2 weeks each fall, 3 weeks each fall, excuse me, and that we will have access to that, and we'll sign an agreement with them.
But the Exhibit A does not show that. It shows that we're in its long-term state. So after 2018, you might not have access to their parking
We
lot.
might not. And what the Exhibit A that I just laid down there was for Spring Sale Book Show, by the way.
Right, no, I'm looking in
Okay.
our
Yeah.
attachments.
Spring is not as affected by that particular parcel. Fall has always worked as they get that piece if they come to a private understanding with the people, and that's how we continue to move forward. Because obviously the city has no control over that particular parking lot, and never really has.
Right.
But you
Okay.
are correct. After 2018, there is no guarantee for us on that parking lot at this point.
Does that mean you need more space in the water? In other words, I'm looking at Exhibit A with this legislation. I don't know whether this is the same profile we've always had, or is this expanding out some?
This is exactly the same. as
Exactly the
been
same,
in the
okay.
leases, and is in the 2017 lease at this point in time and beyond. We've looked at the option of making water into land, making floating space on
Right.
and it's hugely expensive. far more than what it would cost for the parking lot.
Right.
So it's an option. We don't have places to store that kind of equipment at this point in time. We are sort of maxing out our storage facility right now, so, and we've been building floats every year for the last 4 years. So it's a problem that we face, and as I said, we've got an open dialogue with the 110 compromise people. There is no guarantee that we'll have that parking lot. We do have access to the Newman parking lot, which is the parking lot
Right.
behind that, just going up through the alley.
Right.
So if we lost that completely, then we would have something. We know that they're taking part of the parking lot away from us. There's a 25-foot square area that is a little notch that comes out of the building in there, and then about 6 feet along next to the building that they're going to use for a walkway down. But other than that, they have indicated that they'll enter into a long-term agreement on the parking lot. And I think that the other thing is the long-term agreement with the city helps us a great deal to go and work with these outside property owners in developing long-term agreements with them too. Most
Yeah.
of them have been not willing to go beyond what we have with the city.
Yeah, sure, that was the intent
Right.
of going to this longer term. So let me, the first lease is 1 year with 4 automatic
5.
renewals. Well, it's a total of 5, but,
No, it's a total of 6. It's a,
oh, a total of 6,
it's
okay.
a total of 6.
And then there's one more option or automatic of,
It is an option at the boat show's discretion for an additional 4 years.
okay, all right, so it's in effect a 10-year lease.
Yes, if for
Right.
city purposes, we should look at it as a 10-year lease, presuming there will be no defaults or,
Right.
city, sea level rises.
And we don't get into any trouble with us encumbering future councils?
Because we have there's termination for default language in there, and because we sort of have the 1-year check-in point for defaults, I'm comfortable with doing it. And I've talked with the former city attorney.
Okay, I'm not going to ask any more questions.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with
I worried, I mean, we'll have to see if somebody raises that, but I'm good.
It's a 10-year guarantee to the city of revenue
Yeah,
from the boat shows.
it's 10-year guarantee for 1 year.
The issue was raised, right? We did the same thing on the Market House, which was from
Yeah.
one councilman. So
I know,
there is-
It's just, we've seen it come up in a context higher than us, so just
Understand.
want to make sure. I have no other questions, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Leonard, on the staff report, last paragraph, there's you have rent shall be the greater of either, and there's little I for one. There's no second I.
I will double check that. I was trying to do these along with several other staff reports, so I might have just.
Okay, I think it should go where it says right before,
Are you looking at this, is it both or spring or fall one?
on the
This is-
0917.
Okay, so the 09 staff report.
Last paragraph, and I just it's not to criticize the typo, it's more to make sure I understand the rent. It's either going to be it's the greater of 50% of gross receipts from ticket sales, or 2, a specified minimum payment. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, and that specified minimum payment is set in the lease, although it's not in the staff report, and it's increased based on the CPI.
Yeah, I might not have just put, because when I was doing the staff report, we were still working on initial numbers, but for 0917, it's going to be the greater of 50% of the ticket sales, or the sum calculated by increasing $385,000 by 50% of the amount of the consumer price index over the 12 months preceding. So it's sort of a complicated formula, but it's basically what we're doing is we're taking $385,000 was the minimum payment for the directly preceding lease, which would have been,
I got it.
and then we're just upping it, but we didn't want to calculate it now because we wanted to calculate
Sure.
it based on.
But why take 50% of the CPI, not 100% of the CPI?
That was what was negotiated between Mr. Jacobs and our finance department.
Seems like a big win to you.
Actually, the bigger problem for us was the compounding of CPI on top of CPI on top of CPI. And if you work through about 10 years of that, we're potentially increasing our rent by 50 or 60%. So the bigger well, that doesn't necessarily mean that helps the boat shows. If the CPI increases and the cost of living goes up, the boat shows do not as well. So the bigger thing for us was that we were able to cap the increases over a period of time. And
Cap the increases?
capping it at 10% total.
Yeah.
Okay.
Given in consideration, especially for the fall lease, that Mr. Jacobs has not paid the minimum payment in years. It has always been ticket sales. The minimum payment is just sort of our safety net to make sure that the city makes it out of it without incurring significant loss. So the finance director and Mr. Jacobs came up with this formula, which they thought was a sort of a fair compromise over 10 years, especially for an alternative that the city is hoping is not used anyway.
As I'm sitting next to two-thirds of the finance committee, I'll let them further consider whether that's good or not. Environmental issues, just trying to think through, since we are supposed to be focused on the environmental considerations, I'm assuming, though I didn't identify it, still we're putting out recycling and trash in equal proportions, still collecting all recycling and trash and disposing of accordingly.
Yeah, all that language should be the same from previous. That wasn't changed.
Any other environmental impacts that the committee should be considering?
I think so.
That I'm aware of. By the way, we have an organization that we employ. We have contractors that do a lot of the work. One of them is our trash collection, and they also do the same thing for the Marine Corps Marathon and some pretty big events. So they know how to pick up trash.
Okay.
So, and we keep adding every year. We add a couple more of the recycling and trash stations and keep increasing those numbers as well.
I'm not going to suggest at this late date that what I'm about to say get incorporated into these leases, although it is going to my chance for the next 11 years. But it would be nice if, as a city and for events, I'm also talking to Ms. Broadbent, if we were dissuading the use of plastics more than we do, whether it's for bottles of having the water fountains that are refilling a water bottle handy, like we have at the Pitt Memorial Rec Center. If we had that downtown to eliminate the desire for people to buy disposable single-use plastic containers, whether it was for the plastic wrap that's used for food that's sold down there, it would be nice if we had just a greater initiative, more globally, not picking on the boat shows,
No,
to achieve
by
that.
the way,
so.
we've been looking. We've looked for the last 2 years to find a sponsor for refill stations. We'd like to do that as well, and have not found one yet.
Okay.
But we'd like to do the same thing. We always find half-filled water bottles,
Right.
and we don't sell them. They're coming from outside the show and bringing them in.
Right.
Same with the food, but it's still there. And there must be a better way.
Yeah. Right. All right. Any other questions?
Nope.
Okay. Thank you for your time. I'll look for a motion to recommend favorably ordinances 09 and 01017.
Second?
All those in favor?
Aye.
None opposed? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good luck.
Wait a minute, don't we have another one?
No, we did 09 and 010 together.
Oh, we did them together, okay, all right. Good.
Did you have any questions?
We were efficient, no.
All right, moving on to general discussion. We still don't have anyone from AEC. AEC, so we'll just take up you, Mr. Gerald, and anyone else that you'd like to bring with you to speak about water treatment plant update.
Yes.
Good afternoon. My name's
Sorry, Mr. Director Durrell, if you can Continue, please.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is David Jarrell. I'm the Director of Public Works. Sitting to my left is Tor Burkhart, who's the Water and Sewer Program Manager, and sitting to my right is Lily Openshaw, who's the Project Manager for the Water Treatment Plant Project. So by way of update of the status of the Water Treatment Plant Project, a little bit of good news. So the next big milestone for the water treatment plant is to start up the plant. So there's going to be this phase where they're going to start all the equipment. They haven't run it all simultaneously. They've tested individual pieces as they went. But now they're starting it up and starting to run water through to actually treat water. So it's going to be like a test drive of a new car, right? Where they're going to run all the equipment, they're going to run different scenarios, they're going to run the treatment trains in different combinations to see that it all works properly. So this is a very important phase that we just are starting today. It's expected to take somewhere between seven days and 2 weeks to get all the bugs worked out. And then they'll proceed with what's listed as the performance test. So the water that's being produced during this startup phase is actually going to be sent to the existing plant and run through as if it were untreated water. So once that phase is done and we start the performance test, we're actually producing potable water that's going to be put out into the distribution system. So they need to be able to successfully run the plant 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for about 30 days. Once they make it through that phase, then the plant is beneficially complete. In other words, we can make use of the plant. And then they'll move on to the next phase, which is start taking down some of the equipment from the old plant. Because all we're going to leave out there is the current filtration plant, which is a very historic building and should remain. And hopefully at some point we'll be able to make good use of that building as a museum or some other sort of building. But they're going to take down all the other equipment, all the basins and the add-on to the historic building, and then get the site cleaned up, add the wash water facility, add the driveway and the parking areas. And so we expect that is going to take until probably late August, early September. So we still have a ways to go on this project, but the good news is that it's going to actually start producing water. That's a real big milestone. And we're moving, there's light at the end of the tunnel, and it's not a train coming to run us down. So again...
I'm sorry, Director Jarrell, I want to make sure I just got those dates right. So this testing just started today?
Started today.
Okay.
What's the wash water facility?
Can you describe it? You can probably better...
Okay. So basically, if you will, when you filter out the iron and manganese, which are the main items that are in the water that we treat for, when you filter those out, you have to get rid of that waste, and it goes to the sewer system. But in the process of backwashing the filters, you actually backwash it and then are able to recycle some of that back to the head of the plant, because the supernatant is just fine. You just bring it to the head of the plant and goes through and treats again. So that wash water facilities is that backwash collection and also the solids management, dealing with the solids going into the sewer.
So where do all of those iron and magnesium, where do they go? Where do they go?
To the sewer system. Yeah,
Okay,
to
how
our
does it
wastewater.
come off of the bottom of the tanks, or how do you collect that?
So there's sort of two main processes, what we call flocculation sedimentation, which is taking the bigger part of the settlable solids out, and that settles to the bottom of the tank, then is collected and goes to the sewer. Then the filters take the finer particulate out. Same thing, iron and manganese, but the finer material. And then it goes to the wash water, and that's what where it's backwashed. The filters are backwashed, but then they settle that water and the supername can go back to the head of the plant. So
And-
it all eventually goes to the sewer, everything that's
Right, and the
becomes-
sewer then takes it over to the treatment plant?
Right,
across
so
the
it
back road?
actually feeds to the county sewer because our water treatment plant is in the county
Right.
and our sewer treatment plant's in the
Okay,
city.
so they get
city
it.
county, so.
But then, I mean, it doesn't ever end up in streams or?
No.
Okay.
Going back to the dates, so water testing started today, should last for 30 days, and then should have, assuming the test goes well, in 30 days, the city is now able to use the new water treatment plant? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so the startup phase, we expect to take about somewhere between a week and 2 weeks. So that's where we just started the startup phase, where it's that test drive thing, where we're actually sending that water to the existing plant to be treated again as if it were untreated water. Once we get through this 7 to 14 day startup period, when we're confident that they're ready to run, then they start this performance test where they have to run it continuously around the clock, producing water that goes into the distribution system. So they have their water treatment plant operators running the plant right now. At the end of that 30 days, then we take over the operations with our staff. So for this first period, the 7 to 14 day test, we're still run the plant as if nothing had changed. The water's coming over. Our water treatment plant operators are running the plant, in addition to the contractors' operators running their plant. At the end of that period, then our operators take over the new plant. At the end of the 30-day period, take over, and it's basically ours.
Okay. And then what is that transition like? I'm asking more out of curiosity. I mean, will
It's
the
a
water
very
be shut off
stressful
here and
time
start
right
here?
now for the water treatment plant. I can tell you that Jim Fitzgerald, who's our plant superintendent, is very stressed out right now.
Yeah.
It's a difficult time. He is. He's great and wonderful, but it's
It's
a
basically
very
shutting off
stressful
one
time.
valve and opening up another, and now your water comes from a new source?
Not quite that.
Essence.
That's it.
Right. Hmm. Have you introduced yourself? I'm sorry. You introduced her, right?
Yeah, Lily Openshaw, and
Yeah.
she's our project manager, so she's the.
I meant for Ms. Gaines' purposes. I didn't know if she got a name. Oh, check your mic.
Check.
That's better.
Here.
There you go. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry to
Yeah,
interrupt you.
it's stressful enough. Usually, the water treatment plant operators are our after-hours call center for anything that's Public Works related. But because they're so busy and sort of preoccupied, we've had to move that function, just to give you an example of how busy they are and how difficult this period is for them.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you, at one more level of detail, just to explain what they're going through, that they're getting trained on all the different process equipment, pumps, these clarifiers, these aerators. So we have the manufacturers coming in almost daily to do training with the operators, and then they're operating the plant. And then we're having a morning meeting at 7 o'clock to go over the testing that's going to proceed during that day on the new plant, so that the operators can come over and watch the new equipment being in process. So there's just a lot of, they're becoming very familiar through training and also observation during these testing periods.
Who's supervising this? Who's responsible for ensuring all that's going? Is that you, David?
I guess ultimately, yeah. I mean,
Or is it,
No, the mayor.
Lily's, yeah, the mayor
Well,
ultimately,
the
but Lily is the project manager. We have a full owner's rep team of consultants out there that are overseeing it, and the contractor's responsible for quality control. So we do quality assurance. They are responsible for building in the quality and running the tests and doing all the things that they're supposed to do, but they're overseen by, what's our staff out there, 7 or 8 people?
7 or 8
watching
that
everything?
rotate through, probably 3 are there at different times. So it was an involved process. There were 4 levels of testing, and there were plans that were developed and reviewed, and schedules that were established, and staffing plans, very important, along the way.
Alderman Arnett?
So I notice you keep using the word operators with an S. I thought when this was first explained to us, we were gonna go from 12 staff to 1, and this was all gonna be fully automated. Are there now more operators than, or did I just misunderstand when it was first explained?
I don't think we'll ever get down to 1. We're going to significantly reduce. We've always had operators out there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's going to change. At least initially, we're going to keep at that staffing to make sure the plant's running properly and all the bugs are out of it. Even after the 30-day period, for some, it'll be months, it won't be years, but it'll probably be a month or 2 to keep the full staffing. Then we'll draw back to shifts during the day, probably 7 days a week, at least initially. What we want to get to eventually is just staffing there during the week, during the day. So it would just be the 1 shift. But you still have to have people on call. We'll still have a superintendent. We'll still have a instrument tech, because there's a lot more instrumentation out there now than there was before, and that's how you can do the automated. There'll still be maintenance people. Less maintenance people, because with new equipment we should have less problems. So the staffing is going to draw way down, but I don't think we'll ever get to just having 1 operator. I think it'll
What is
be-
it now, and what will it, do you anticipate it
We
going?
have 5 or 6 operators now.
I thought I
It's
remember
at
the
least
number
5 or
12.
6, and we have a couple of maintenance techs. We have the instrument tech. We have an assistant superintendent and a superintendent. So that staffing's going to be drawn back.
Okay, I guess it would be helpful to know a little bit more about that, because I thought one of the, when we were evaluating what to do, of course, it was the big thing was that it was more costly up front, but over the life of this project, it was a wash between us doing it or going with the county. But then another savings I remember being touted was a significant, I thought, dramatic reduction in the number of staff.
And it is. Yeah,
Okay.
it's going to be. It's probably going to be more than 50%, probably more like a 60%, 60,
Okay.
or 2/3 reduction in staff.
So if we could get some breakdown of that, that would
Sure.
be helpful.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So the literally $1 million question is, are we still on budget, and are we still on time? I think everybody knows that we're not on time. The expected completion date for the project was last year, February. In fact, it's an easy to remember date. It was February 14th, Valentine's Day of last year. So that's when the contractor was officially late and we started assessing liquidated damages, which are built into the contract to cover the additional costs that we have of them being late. The good news is that they're bearing all of those costs. So we're keeping our pretty large team out there in place, thanks to the liquidated damages, and we're also continuing to pay those higher costs of having an old plant with full staffing with those costs. The other thing that we focus and made the primary focus throughout this project is quality. Quality's always been first. 20 years from now, people are going to forget that it was a year late and that it was $1 or $2 over budget, but they're going to see the quality of the project. So that's always been first and foremost. So we think we're going to get a good quality project that's going to work well and going to work well for a lot of years. And that certainly has been our goal. So we think it's going to finish on budget, certainly not under, but it shouldn't be over with the quality that we need, but significantly later than what we expected.
Does the compensation that the city get cover the, you referred to covering the personnel, but I'm thinking if it's the longer that it gets delayed where you have to have the full staff there before you draw down, the more expensive it gets to have it. People get raises and pension expenses and so on. So if you try to calculate what those extra expenses are going to be for that calculation, what
Yes,
you get
so when
reimbursed?
we originally were putting together the contract, when you establish the liquidated damages, that has to be based on some realistic estimate of what your damages are going to be.
Mhm.
So it included all of those types of things. So we think that this $2,000 a day is covering all of those costs. The thing it might not cover is if we have, an old piece of equipment in the existing plant that we have a catastrophic breakdown of some major piece of equipment, which we have not, so we haven't had to face that, but if we do, it probably would not cover that. But at that point, it becomes actual damages, and as you know, as an attorney, we conceivably could go after additional actual damages if we could justify them, but that would take a lawsuit to do that.
Is the same contractor the entity that is warranting these products? Providing the warranty for these, all the systems in place, all the machinery in place?
So all of the equipment is warranted by the manufacturer. The contractor provides a one-year warranty for workmanship and for anything that might go wrong during the first year. But then after that, it becomes equipment warranties that cover it, and those are through the manufacturer. And I guess, like for the roof, the roof manufacturer would warrant that for the pumps and motors and all those types of things. Those are all through the manufacturer.
Okay. As it relates to the water fee, I'm trying to project from what you're saying whether there's going to eventually be an opportunity to decrease, or will be a need for increasing water fees, or are the water fees correct where they are now?
The water fees, as they are now, were increased based on what the budget cost of the water treatment plant. So as long as we don't greatly exceed that budget, and again, we haven't yet, and we don't expect to, but unless we did that, the water fees should be right where they should be.
Okay. And it's an enterprise fund, so it has to pay for itself.
So I assume, I think I remember a contingency amount that when we were letting the contract, I assume we've used that all up.
Yeah, so there were several different contingencies. There was a contractor's contingency, a pot of money that they could use if things came up. There was also an owner's allowance that we could use either for things like change conditions, which the contractor wouldn't know about, that we would normally have to pay, or if we decide we wanted to add some things. Things come up as you're doing the construction. You don't always foresee everything during the design. So if you want to add some things, we had an allowance for that. We also had some sort of hidden allowances because we had an award fee that the contractor would have been able to, if they would have been timely and done the things they were supposed to do, they would have been able to earn that. And there was also an early completion fund that was available.
It was another fee that they could have earned.
So we had some carrots in addition to the stick of the liquidated damages. They haven't earned any of that, so that's additional money that would be available to potentially cover
So
costs.
can you give us a general sense of, because I thought I remembered this was like the best in the country firm. How did we get behind?
Well,
I heard you told us about a bad concrete pour. but
yeah, there was a
that's-
bad concrete pour, and that hurt them a lot. And one of the most fundamental things that has happened is when we first envisioned this project, we envisioned it going on a different part of the site, a site that's not so congested right behind our existing plant. But this, you recall that this is design build, so they provided technical proposals, and what they proposed was to put it right where that old Claire well was, right behind the plant.
Right.
Well, as it turns out, that was a very difficult place to build within the time that was allowed. It's just very congested. There's a lot of site utilities run through there, the existing plants on one side and the clear wells on the back side. And that has affected their productivity throughout. They've also had some quality issues that we have held tight on to make them do rework, and rework really impacts the schedule to their detriment. So I think those are probably the big three things. They've continually, throughout the whole project, been more optimistic in their scheduling than what they've been able to actually achieve. Just every month they lose a few days on the schedule. So when I left in December, we were still thinking they were going to produce water in February, and now here we are in March. So in those 2 months, they moved back another
Well,
month.
wait a minute, are they a year late or 2 months late?
A year and 2 months.
They're 14 months.
14 months,
Almost
okay.
14, actually,
Right.
I guess 13 months.
Right.
So it was February of last year, February of 16. that they
So
were
it's
to be
late
complete
but not over budget.
for the city. It certainly is for them.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But
They should've
because
sent
for
us
the
our 8
contractor, you know, the LDs are actually the cheaper part of this because they have to keep their full staff there.
Right.
And they, so their costs are much, much higher than what
You
they.
said $2,000 a day, so that's 14, it'll end up being about 14, 15 months at $2,000 a day? Wow.
Hmm.
Pretty steep.
It's a chunk, you know.
Yeah.
Change.
Going back to the water fee issue for a second, is there not a surplus that's rising or decreasing? The surplus is each year is staying about the same?
For the water
The
fund?
water
The
fund?
fund, the enterprise
fund.
fund.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it's a surplus at all, but I'd have to check with Bruce on that, whether there's a surplus.
Well, it
trying
has to have
keep-
the minimum surplus. I think it's,
Oh, you mean the cash balance?
Right.
I think it's pretty steady.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
when do we get to see it?
Anytime you'd like, and I included some pictures.
I
so-
see 'em.
Lily, do you want to talk through what each of those pictures is? I guess the top left is pretty obvious that that's,
This is the exterior, in the center will be the completed administration control building. To the left of that is the large maintenance bay, where everyone behind it would be the process facilities, and you can see the filter tanks in the lower left, and the flocculation tanks, sludge collectors tanks over in the lower right, and
So we
as
still
soon
have
as
our,
the snow clears, you're welcome to come out and take a tour.
yeah, well,
We'll be testing, we're starting testing today, and as David said, the first week or two is looking at getting different trains working together, and then the 30-day demonstration test, everything should really be humming, and I think that would be a great time to come out
Yeah.
in maybe 3 weeks.
yep, let us know. So we still have the $2 million closed tank, million gallon closed tanks, right? Do we have the open, water space, or is that gone now?
that's gone. So that's right where the new plant's built.
Right,
That
okay,
big
so it's
bowl
true.
that was right behind the plant.
Right,
That's
That's,
where this is right now.
Yeah,
The
that was-
the
that was-
first phase was to demo that
Mhm.
concrete tank.
okay. All right, yeah, right. Like to come and see it.
As would I.
Sure.
Yep.
Nope.
Okay. Thank you all. Appreciate your time.
thank you.
Let us know when the invitation's outstanding. Ms. Broadbent, anything you'd like to add? Always happy to give you an opportunity. Was Mr. Andrews looking for a moment, or was he just curious about the discussion?
Good afternoon, Maria Broadbent, Office of Environmental Policy. No, I think he was just visiting.
Okay.
Just wanted to, the one thing that I will just bring up from your conversation today is I have come up with, and I've never released it, but I have come up with sort of an environmental stewardship certification program for special events. And you know, some of the things that you talked about are kind of on that list, and I think one that's rising to the top in the General Assembly, and you know, DC just passed legislation banning styrofoam. And you know, that's something at some point that we should all think a little bit more about. There are so many other alternatives right now, and certainly in terms of special events when people are not taking things home, but they're disposing of them in ways that tend to have more chance of blowing away or end up where they shouldn't be. Not having styrofoam for those kinds of food vendors would make a lot of sense environmentally. But I have nothing really to add to the legislation. So.
Well, along those lines, I'll just point out, this committee, in its current form, has 6 more meetings, unless we add or subtract any. It's not a lot of time. And I don't say that in terms of, let's just try to have it end without doing as much. I want to make sure we're productive as possible until the end. So to the extent that you have some initiatives that we could assist you in bringing to the fore, whether through the budget process or through legislation, our time is limited. 6 more meetings.
Well,
Wow.
for budget even more, so like I was thinking about it, where are we with the WIP? Do we need anything in the budget for consideration? Is it in there?
My understanding is that there will be some significant funding put into the budget for projects towards the WIP. So-
In the CIP?
In the CIP, because most of the projects are capital in nature, they're construction, they're projects that are, once they're finished, determined to be in. That's right.
I thought that $1 million was for the backflow valves. There's $1 million for the water improvement.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't get a whole brief on it, but.
And is it in the column that goes over to M?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, I have
Okay.
to look at what they gave us yesterday, but that'd be a good question for the next meeting.
Yeah, definitely.
That-
Because
that's
there are
right.
numbers that are showing up on the left-hand side of the spreadsheet that don't necessarily migrate over to the middle or the right-hand side, so that, you might want to watch that, just to make sure.
Understood. From where I sit, brought things forward. The discussion was that the mayor was very interested in having funding in the capital budget towards the stormwater management, you know, WIP projects. And to balance that out and to stretch those funds out, we have put in for a number of grants to, you know, to add to that. So Racine in my office is, and that's provided that the funding isn't affected by changes in the EPA. But Racine is working on a grant for $1 million for a project that we call the Schubert Project over near the Homewood neighborhood. We've also put in for funding to help pay for a project in Back Creek by Ellen Moyer Nature Park, and a couple others. I've put in some funding which is related. I put in a grant request an hour ago to do a GIS tool with the Chesapeake Conservancy so that we can find more places to plant trees in the city, and also be able to use that same tool as a venue to keep our tree inventory, because we don't really have a complete tree inventory citywide right now. And we will also be able to use that to help the Conservancy Board target pieces of property that they could pursue for more conservation easements. And along with that is planting of 100 trees in the parole and design district parts of Ward 3. Yeah, so we've been doing what we can to stretch that funding out, you know, knowing that those funds are at a premium. I feel comfortable saying that we'll get some of them. You know, if you write grants, I can tell you that the last grant you've written is as hard or as stressful or as tedious as the first one you've ever written. And that's just how they go. I mean, you put as much work into writing $1 million grant as you do for one for 20,000. So, but I feel pretty good that whatever funding that we do get in the capital improvement budget, that staff is doing our best to stretch that out through grants, provided the federal government doesn't affect their fund.
So I do see $1 million for this coming CIP and then $1 million in the next 5 years after, $6 million. So there's two questions. One, is that enough? But more importantly for the Finance Committee, do we have the stormwater, this is a enterprise fund, do we have fees set
So that,
high
yeah,
enough to pay for that debt service?
that'll be the question when the administration brings forward the budget is if they're allocating that money, how much of that is from the existing fee structure that is being allocated to that versus some other things, and how much of it is any sort of increase in the
Right.
the thing. But yeah, I mean, we'll have to see how it'll have to balance when it comes to us. The question is that the right way to do it, or is it the right number, right? You know?
So the
And
6
those are
million
certainly policy decisions that all of you need to talk about. It is not actually set up as an enterprise fund. An enterprise fund is a closed-loop system, meaning that everything has to be funded by what is taken in, like the water fund, the sewer fund, or the solid waste fund.
It's just like them on this spreadsheet.
It does not completely support everything that is
Well, I
included
know.
in the CIP.
I realize that,
Yeah.
and that's part of the problem. But the $1 million, part of the reason I'm asking this is because I remember walking around in the woods on Lower Farragut Creek and being very enamored with the most complete, I think it was option 3, and we ended up having to do option 2A, not even 2B. And it's problematic whether that's really going to mean anything because we didn't get to Upper Farragut Creek. So I'm relying on you to tell us whether this $6 million is a reasonable and realistic amount to accomplish what has to be done under the WIP and other stormwater things over this coming year and 5 after that.
So our permit goal is to 2025.
Right.
So it's 8 or 9 years.
Right.
And the fee study that we had done came out to about $9 million. Although we will reduce that cost as we go forward by projects that are done by our partners, Spa Creek Conservancy, St. Luke's, Back Creek. Some of those, their funding's tied, some of it to the federal government also. So
There is no more federal government.
there,
Got wiped out.
some of the funding is coming just from the General Assembly and projects that are being funded from the state, and that's really good news for all of us. So all of those things are tied together. 9.5 was the amount to get all of the TMDL credit that we needed to get from the AECOM study. It was about 9.5
Yeah.
from
so
now
we'll
to
get close.
2025.
Now we're going to be short, because we'll only get 2 more years so we'll only be at 8 million, not 9.5.
But that's not taking into account a couple of things.
Other things that aren't coming out of bonds, yeah, okay.
Things that aren't coming out of
Now,
bonds.
You're our person, you gotta keep us, make sure that we're paying attention to whether or not enough money is going into these things. I guess now I'm your person. I hope, I might not be your person either.
I
We know these two won't be your person, they're quitters.
I'm quit. Just have not doing a big difference.
Well, I think all 3 of you were here and have listened to Frank Biba and I,
Yeah.
and when we were telling you how much was going to cost, and you heard us.
Yeah.
And you also helped fund the watershed improvement plan and the studies that we did associated with that. And know that that's already paid for itself. So by having that work done, I was able to easily turn, one of the 16 projects in there into a grant for $175,000, $150,000. So you already got your money back. But it also gave us a position in our permit where we're a little ahead of the game. So, no, not capital-wise, but in the things that we need to do. So the first thing that our new permit will require of us is do an inventory of all our stormwater management practices. That was the first step in the project that you funded. The next thing will be to create a watershed improvement plan. You're already a little ahead of the game. So, as much as we need to keep those things up, we at least have a path forward and a vision for what it is that we need to do. And I can tell you from sitting in a meeting a week ago with folks from across the state up in Baltimore, MDE, that there's a lot of people that are pretty wide-eyed that are in the phase 2 category like we are. Even phase 1s, I met with someone from one of the counties, and they're looking at paying $1 million to do the inventory that we just did. So yes, it is my job to come back to you and the administration when there's something that I need, but I want you to know that we've really been able to take advantage of the funding that you have given us to get organized and have a vision for what we need to do to comply.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to frame it, and my hope is that by the time this budget is done, we will figure out some way to make it really tangible, right? Whether it is an increase in the rate or it's linking bond proceeds to do projects, that we do something that in the out years gets easier to do because you do it this year for the first time. And I'm not sure which way the administration wants to go or which way the majority of the council wants to go, but I think, by the end of this term, if we could do something where to build on all the good work of all the AECOM stuff and all the projects and all the folks in the community who are trying to go out and do local projects in different watersheds, to basically have a sustainable dollar supply that will flow into that going forward, then that's something. We can pull that off, so.
I envision one of those fundraising thermometers. Same idea.
Yeah.
Well, it's TMDLs, it's how many acres treated.
Yeah.
We already jumped a bit ahead by even knowing how many we have to treat.
Yeah.
The meeting I was
That's a
in,
good idea.
I was in the meeting last week and there were people who didn't know how many acres they needed to treat. They weren't there yet.
Where would we put that?
On the website.
Pardon?
On the website. Oh, right here.
No, I
So
think it should be
it
on
would
top of-
make my heart
I think it should be on
beat
top
every
of
time I come
110
in.
compromise. Above the water level.
There are also non-structural practices that we have to think about. Planting more trees, pet wastes, collection systems, street sweeping in a different way than we're doing now. Those things are all worth some credit. They still have an expense, though.
A couple housekeeping things. I moved our meeting for September and October a week up. So September, we're meeting on September 14th. October, it's October 12th. What else? Oh, topics. Cindy, I think we already had a topic planned for next meeting, right?
Cindy will remind me of those
Stormwater.
dates.
What's that?
I said Cindy will help remind me of those dates.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I only go to the meetings when Cindy tells me to. Right?
So stormwater is the next one. If you touch base with Bruce, make sure we see the financial side of it, and from your side or from the administration side, the project piece of it, and with an eye towards whether the stormwater fee is sufficient, and what, if it got raised, how it would be justified.
Okay.
Can I suggest that we ought to get in quickly one on sea level? Because that's really been off in Lisa land, and I don't think there's any real focus on this in the places that we focus.
That's an excellent topic. Cindy, do we have anything for May? To make sea level May? We'll need a few people from your side of the table and take your direction on who those people are. To have a good robust discussion about it.
Will do.
Thank you. Anything else? No? All right. Thanks, everyone. Meeting's closed.
Sometimes it's lucky when you have the right pieces in your briefcase.
Let me see that.
Yeah. Did you get, I don't remember, did you get an email from Bill Herring?
No, after that meeting?
Yeah.
No.
He's very concerned about the CAD